April 9, 1943, North Atlantic 02-17 Gale Force 8. Sea State, Mountains. Inside a boat named U-3X, the world was red. Battle lamps bled over sweating faces as rose petal pings rang the pressure hull like a slow bell. Horturette needles trembled. Oil and breath made the same taste. Batterian Halton, Oberleutnant Karl Heiden said, voice in his throat, not his mouth. Rudder Hart stewardboard. The bow swung. The depth crept. Somewhere above, a convoy's black stern lights climbed and fell like distant lanterns in a storm. Somewhere closer, a cutter rode the ridge of a watery hill and listened with a steel ear. On the cutter's bridge, LT, James Dwyer braced a knee against the console and watched green water explode across the forecastle. Contact steady, range closing, the sonar man called, clipped and calm. Come right. Hedgehog stand by, Dwyer said. His breath fogged the visor of the bridge hood, then fled downwind. A bell, a tilt. The ship's bow punched a valley and rose again, shining with cold fire. Mark fire, Dwyer ordered. The sea spat 24 spiked bombs in a curved bouquet. They vanished. One breath, two. Then the sea coughed. A deep whump, not thunder, not wave. U-3X lurched, ballast slamming. In the conning tube, Heiden tasted blood. Up top, a white cone of searchlight found a boiling patch of oil and a torn fin breaking surface like a dying shark. The North Atlantic, early 1943, the ocean had turned into a graveyard of steel. Convoys crawled east like stitched scars across a heaving gray body, escorted by ships that bled coal smoke and nerves. The Kriegsmarine called it Rudel tactic, Wolfpack tactics. The U.S. Navy called it chaos you could navigate by. For 6 months, the balance had tipped between hunter and hunted so often that neither side could tell which it was anymore. U-boats moved in packs of 10 or 12, fanning out along the convoy routes HX and SC, waiting for merchant silhouettes to betray themselves against the cloud-smeared moon. Each one carried 44 men, 44 cigarettes short of mercy. They lived on condensed breath, mildew, and rumor. Food was mold, air was damp metal, sleep a rumor. The youngest aboard, like Otto, were still boys who pretended the sea was a test of manhood rather than an education in dying slowly. Above them prowled cutters, corvettes, and destroyers, American, British, Canadian, each with its own sonar heartbeat and a single commandment: hold the line. The convoys they guarded were arteries of civilization: grain, oil, trucks, aircraft parts, penicillin, letters that said I'm alive. Lose the line, lose the war. The cutter USCGC Wakefield was one of the new breed. 83 meters of steel, flat-keeled and temperamental in heavy swell, but her crew trusted her like a superstition. She had the delicate balance of a boxer and a choir singer, agile, but only if you knew her moods. On her bridge, Lieutenant James Dwyer read sonar charts the way priests read psalms. He was 28, built like a carpenter, voice even under strain. His executive officer, Ruth Pike, older, carried 20 years of sea-weathered profanity and 2 broken ribs from a rescue drill that had gone wrong in 41. Together, they had turned discipline into something almost gentle. Below decks, pharmacist's mate Nora Hale had turned the sickbay into a cathedral of order. Enamel trays shone like mirrors, every bottle tied down with string, every bandage rolled like ammunition. Her handwriting in the casualty log was so precise that even in blackout conditions it seemed to glow faintly in the red light. They were not killers, not by trade. They were guardians of lanes, mothers of convoys. But war had turned guardianship into a kind of sanctioned hunting. Their sonar men called it fishing for thunder. Each echo was a life waiting to end. Each depth charge a question posed to the abyss. Across the horizon, beyond where radar could reach, U-3X hunted alone. Her captain, Kapitän-Lieutenant Ernst Vetter, had been forced to detach from his pack after mechanical trouble. Now she was stalking by instinct, submerged too long, batteries bleeding dry. When they surfaced for air that April night, their watchman reported a faint pattern of lights far off, 4 specks against nothing. The convoy. Vetter ordered pursuit. Silent run, he said. No transmissions. The men obeyed with the quiet of exhaustion. At 0140, the cutter's HFDF, high-frequency direction finder, caught a whisper of static. Just a few syllables of a message between boats before U3X went dark again. Dwyer's hand hovered over the chart. The convoy was in a staggered screen, 30 freighters, 5 escorts. "Bearing 280, said the sonar operator, the voice dry as chalk. "Contact faint, closing starboard quarter." Dwyer looked at Pike. "One of ours." "Not unless we've started using diesel fumes as perfume." Dwyer nodded once. "Action stations." The ship turned into the wind. Floodlights stayed off. Men ran without sound, boots cushioned in rubber matting. In the sonar shack, the operator's headphones filled with soft knocking, the rhythmic pulse of a propeller changing pitch. The ocean itself seemed to breathe slower, waiting for the first weapon to speak. By 0210, U3X was beneath the convoy's tail, depth 80 meters, course steady. Heiden checked his depth gauge twice. "Steady," he told his crew, though his voice wasn't steady. "We'll take her up periscope depth, range finder on the lead freighter." They began to rise, slowly, too slowly. Above, Wakefield's hydrophones caught the upward drift, the faint Doppler hum of ballast vents. Dwyer's jaw flexed once. "Range steady," the sonar man murmured. "Set Hedgehog pattern 2, Dwyer replied. He leaned into the mic. "Weapons, stand by to fire." In that instant, the distance between two machines measured less than the span of mercy itself. And down below, in the hot, stale dark, Heiden wiped condensation from his periscope and saw a white cone of light sweep across the sea, hunting him like dawn coming too early. War at sea is an argument between instruments and elements. The instruments speak in numbers. The elements answer in fists. HF/DF, Huff Duff, was the first voice that night, a loop of wire and math that could point a finger through storm. A U-boat's short burst to its pack might last 4 seconds. The loop swung, the needle dipped, and a bearing became a line on a chart. Not a location, never a gift, just a hint. The ocean kept its secrets unless you asked twice. ASDIC, the old British name for sonar, was the second voice, a ping shaped like a rose petal that bloomed outward and came back altered by what it touched. Sound in water travels faster than patience. It also lies. Thermoclines bent beams, schools of fish rang like wreckage, and wave noise made constellations that weren't there. A good operator learned to hear the difference between a hull and a rumor. Depth charges were the old religion. Heavy drums rolled off rails or spat from K-guns in a fan, set to explode at guessed depths. They shook everything, scared everything, killed sometimes by brutal arithmetic. Hedgehog was the new heresy. 24 spigot mortars hurled small warheads ahead of the ship. They exploded only on contact. No detonation meant no hit. A haunting silence after firing could feel like failure, right until the hull answered with a soft, sickening whump that told you steel had met steel below. Illumination had its own catechism. Searchlights in convoy work were like matches in a powder room. You used them only when you already owned the room. Better to let star shells do the seeing. White suns on parachutes drifting down, painting the sea in a cold daylight that made wakes glow and wreck oil shine like slate. In Gale, even star shells betrayed you. Wind shoved the light sideways, and spray turned the air into glass. None of it mattered if you couldn't handle a ship in weather. Gale Force 8 stacked the Atlantic into black cliffs that burst into green fire across the bow. The helmsman needed to feel when to meet a sea and when to shoulder past it. The engine room needed to keep steam like a held breath. Open the throttle at the wrong second and you buried the nose. Close it too late and you offered the propellers to air, screaming cavitation, lost bite, lost steerage, lost men. Rescue was its own art, learned in peacetime and hardened in war. Hypothermia kept the clock. 10 to 20 minutes in water that cold before hands stopped knowing they were hands. Oil made it worse and better, worse because it burned eyes and lungs, better because its slick sometimes slowed the kill of cold. Kapok life jackets kept faces up. Me Wests did if men inflated them in time. Panic drowned quicker than bullets. The kit lived forward. Scramble nets bundled like sleeping vines, Jacob's ladders coiled, heaving lines fitted with monkeys' fists to carry themselves accurately across wind. Boathooks leaned under canvas. Blankets, always blankets, were stacked close to the rail, tied with thin twine you could snap with a cold thumb. Coffee urns were lashed waist-high by the hatch, not for comfort but for protocol. Hot liquid first, only sips, then dry, then heat. Never rub frozen limbs. The rule was as sacred as any gunnery table. On the cutter, the standing orders framed the moral math in clean sentences. Escort priority, convoy integrity. When enemy crew appear on the surface beyond combat necessity, commence life-saving operations unless such operations endanger convoy. It was doctrine and tradition together. Sailors, even in war, obeyed the sea's older law. You pull a drowning man out if you can. If he tries to kill you while you do it, you deal with that after his hands are on your rail. Aboard U-3X, the tools were simpler and more intimate. Ballast tanks breathed the boat. Negative dive gave you the first shove down. Blow lifted you like a prayer. Crash dive drills hammered the crew into a single organism. Close hatches, dog them, flood, equalize, trim. In storm, timing mattered to survival. Break surface in a trough and you show only periscope and luck. Break on a peak and the next wave tries to rip the bridge from the boat. The diesels were faithful brutes, the electric motors soft-spoken monks, batteries were a temper with teeth. The men learned to lick condensation off cold pipes when thirst became superstition. Fear had its own equipment. Heiden's watch crew kept pocket knives to cut each other free if lines fouled in a broach. Kalle in the engine room tied grease rags to valves not because the book said so, but because a rag hanging wrong could tell you a valve had begun to chatter before your ears admitted it. Otto, the radio man, kept a scrap of Morse proverbs taped above his key. Short is sure, long is death. Both ships, enemy to enemy, carried the same nerve, a steadiness that isn't bravery so much as refusal to waste seconds. Dwyer's bridge team spoke in half-words that meant whole actions. Pike's deck gang moved like a memory. Nora Hale's sickbay was a diagram drawn with hands. The U-boat crew, sweating in red light, made their world small enough to control. One valve, one gauge, one finger's pressure on a lever. The sea would test each tool, old and new. The arguments between instrument and element would come thick and without punctuation. A hedgehog curve, a pressure hull groan, a blown tank, a white cone of light, then a deck busy with hands making choices under hail. By 02:16, both captains had already chosen what kind of night they would have. The next minutes would decide what kind of men they were. Oberleutnant Karl Heiden kept a private ledger in a grease-stained notebook the crew thought was gunnery math. It was. It was names and dates. Men who'd taught him to trim a boat by feel, men who'd laughed at the first groan of a North Atlantic swell, men whose last sound had been air ripping through a ruptured seal. Heiden had learned a strange humility. Command was not loudness but containment. Hold your fear like a valve holds pressure. Above him tonight, the Atlantic practiced its violence with dignity. He admired that against his will. Funker Otto Weiss was 19 and carried 2 harmonicas he never played. Seasick most hours, he found a trance at the key. Morse was prayer to him, short and long, certainty and doubt, all the world reduced to a fingertip. He detaped a line over his desk. KURZ ist SICHER, short is sure. Tonight there would be no sending. Tonight he listened to the sea's static and imagined each hiss was the voice of home saying his name. Maskinist Cal Dorn spoke to engines as if they were old horses, kindly, with threats. He wore a wool cap even under red lamps, the visor sweat white with salt. He denied being superstitious and then kissed 2 fingers and touched the port motor casing before every crash dive. Pipes sweated. Valves chattered. Tonight the boat had that tired cat feel, ready to kill if you stepped wrong, ready to sleep if you didn't. On the surface, men had other tools. LT, James Dwyer had the odd gift of becoming quieter when danger grew. The bridge team took tone from him. The helmsman settled hands. The sonar operator's shoulders loosened a fraction when Dwyer said steady, because steady meant he saw farther than they could. He'd grown up on a Massachusetts fishing boat where you learned to make decisions before questions arrived. The war had only added bolts and protocols to that habit. BM-1 Ruth Pike ruled the decks with a tired tenderness. He knew each sailor's strengths like a carpenter knows the grain in 2x4s. He didn't forgive sloppy knots or loose ladders. He did forgive fear that came out honest. He kept a pocket rosary of little iron nuts and swore at weather in a way that sounded like prayer. Pharmacist's mate Nora Hale had eyes that could command and hands that apologized while they worked. She de-triaged a torpedoed Norwegian crew the winter before and discovered that the line between living and dying narrowed to 5 inches of blanket and 6 ounces of coffee given in sips. She taught her corpsmen that order was compassion. Label first, speak second, decide third, touch last, because the hand remembers what the mind refuses when the deck tilts. Gale conditions distorted the chessboard. Standard screen geometry, an arc of escorts guarding a convoy's quarters, collapsed inward under weather, and Wakefield played a knife fighter's game instead of a fencer's. Dwyer briefed it once and then lived it. We protect the tail and punish the stalk. If we lose contact, we straddle where they have to be, not where we want them. Hold down was the watchword. Once sonar got a scent, you didn't chase noise. You forced the boat below periscope depth and kept it there until batteries and air did the killing or the U-boat made a mistake to breathe. Hedgehog was perfect for that patience. No explosions to blind your own sonar. No depth charge curtain to make you deaf to the one sound that mattered, the change in propeller note that meant panic. Illumination doctrine flexed with wind. Star shells were reserved for confirm or collect. Confirm the oil streak you thought you saw. Collect survivors after the danger curve flattened. Searchlight stayed dark until Dwyer made the call that the convoy was safe from return fire. Then the cone could be used like a finger pointing at a story the sea tried to swallow. Counterfire discipline kept the deck teams honest. Pike told his gun crews, "We kill efficiently and stop instantly." The phrase sounded impossible until you rehearsed it enough. If the U-boat broached and kept fighting, finish it. If it broached and men came up burning and blind, guns cold, lines out. The bridge would own the moment, but the crews rehearsed the pivots until muscle remembered before thinking asked permission. Rescue lanes were a tactic, not an afterthought. Pike designated starboard the dirty side, oil, wreckage, bodies, and port the clean side, lines, ladders, blankets. It kept chaos from breeding. When command called rescue, port watch flowed without tripping over starboard's work. Men could do mercy like a drill if you gave it a lane. Convoy integrity meant perspective. If another contact appeared or if a second wolf joined the prey, Wakefield would break off rescue. Dwyer didn't pretend otherwise. The law of water was merciful, the law of war was jealous. In calm voice he told Pike, "If we must choose, we choose the living cargo, the 30 ships, over the 10 men we can see. But we will not stop 1 second earlier than the danger demands." Pike nodded once. He'd known captains who hid behind rules to dodge risk. Dwyer used rules to justify courage. Inside U-3X, mathematics kept terror on a leash. Trim was life. Heiden called for 1 ton of water forward, half aft, to counter a starboard swell that threatened to broach them sideways if they surfaced in the wrong trough. Cal watched levels shiver in sight glasses and adjusted like a barber clipping hair, little everywhere. Negative tank flooded on command, throwing the boat down in a controlled fall. Blow negative later would give the upward shove you needed when the conning tower took water through the bridge hatch. Battery management set the clock. The port bank showed 58%, starboard 61%. Any long dance under Hedgehog harassment would eat those numbers to the bone. Cal cut all non-essential draw. Otto's radio went silent. The galley's heat died. Men breathed stale air and ran on will instead. Aztec geometry lived in Wakefield's headphones. The operator traced bearing rate, how quickly the contact's angle changed as a way to compute range. If the bearing held steady and the Doppler shifted, you knew the U-boat was crossing your bow. If the bearing swung fast, you were overrunning. He reported in clipped tones, steady, slow drift port, range moderate. It meant, keep angle, hold your nerve, launch the pattern when the crosswind drops half a knot. Hedgehog pattern 2 threw a crescent ahead, 24 contact fuses that would detonate only if they kissed steel. The psychological hazard was silence. Charges that missed did nothing but sink. Depth charges at least gave you theater. Hedgehog gave you judgment. Dwyer preferred judgment. He set the pattern to fire at the breath between two wave crests so the ship would not smash its bow into its own bombs. Rescue mechanics were science under chaos. Pike stationed 2 men with boat hooks forward, 2 amidships, 2 aft, never more than 6. Too many hands made tangle. Heaving lines overshot on purpose in gale. The trick was to get beyond the man so the wind would blow the coil into him. Nets went down low and slack. A tight net pressed men away. Hale briefed hypothermia triage like a gunnery table. Remove wet first, cut don't untie, sip don't pour, warm chest not limbs. Watch for the afterdrop. The core temperature falling even after rescue. Sickbay rig was built for a night like this. Hale had blankets in a dry locker at shoulder height so a man hugging the wall could reach without looking. Coffee urn lashed waist high. Decks swabbed and sanded for grip. Labels rubber-banded to mugs, warm, small sips. A pewter crucifix screwed to the bulkhead by some previous crewman rattled gently when the ship took green water. She de-left it there. It steadied the room. The technical songs on both sides prepared the same chorus. A hit, a breach, men in the water. A cutter turning its violence into rescue as fast as hands could change tools. Up the ladder to the bridge, Dwyer felt the deck drop and lift like a heart-refusing panic. He breathed salt and diesel and something else, the iron smell storms carry when they plan to write history. He looked at Pike. Guns ready. Pike looked at the dark. Lines, too. The ocean finished a long exhale and waited to see which orders would reach the rails first. Leadership at sea is a grammar of short sentences. Long ones drown. Captain on Wakefield kept his voice low enough that men had to lean in. The ship leaned with them. Dwyer's orders traveled like knotted rope, each not a task, each space a breath. Right 5. Hold depth by ear. Pattern 2, stand by. He never said please on the bridge, he said it afterward when the deck was a kitchen again and men tasted coffee instead of brine. It wasn't softness, it was sequence. He had written his own standing order after watching a Corvette ram a drowning man by accident in a 1942 blow. We are killers by duty, rescuers by instinct. Reverse it the moment killing stops being necessary. He taped the line under the sound-powered phone hook where he alone could see it. It wasn't for show. It was for the half-second when habit wavered and character had to shove. Ruth Pike's leadership lived in hands and knots. On drill nights, he moved silently behind green sailors and retied their work without comment, then placed their own knot in their palm and made them feel the difference. You'll live by what you can do blind, he'd say. Practice blind. When a man panicked on a ladder, Pike never shouted down. He climbed up and took the man's wrist and made him feel a steady pulse that wasn't his. That's the ship, he'd say. Match her, not the sea. Nora Hale commanded without rank. She knew which bosun would faint at blood and which would hold a split scalp closed with his thumb and a joke. She assigned the faint to blankets and the thumb to boat hook. In sickbay, her sentences were ritual. Cut that. Sip this. Count with me. She called men sailor instead of kid because war had made them older than their faces. Leadership aboard U-3X wore a different coat. Heiden ruled by quiet containment. When the boat hissed wrong, he didn't lie. I hear it, he'd say, then make his voice smaller. The crew matched him. Panic in a submarine is a contagion of tone. Heiden inoculated them with understatement. Kalle the machinist led by prediction. Valve 3 will chatter in 2 minutes and I'll be there. Men live longer when the world happens as somebody said it would. Above both ships, the storm led by example. Relentless, indifferent, consistent. Good captains copy weather that way. The sea demands enemies respect each other even while they try to end one another. U-boat culture was tribe and liturgy. The men called their boat boot like a woman's name. They kept mascots, lucky spoons, a cork from the commissioning bottle wired to the control room, a carved gull hung over the chart table. They ate canned black bread and sour meat and pretended it tasted like Hamburg in spring. They joked about death to make space for sleep. They hated the ping most, not the explosion afterward but the accusation before it. The sound that said, "I know where you are." When Hedgehog came to the Atlantic, it felt like a violation of the old duel. No thunder, no rolling curtain, just calm and then judgment. Some crews said it was sneaky. Others said it was clean. Either way, it changed the stories they told themselves about how they would die. On Wakefield, the enemy had no face until rescue. Sonar painted them as bearings and rates. Gunnery called them contact. Only after a broach, only after a white cone showed a helmet where a conning tower used to be, did the enemy become a man with oil in his eyes and a lung that wanted soup more than oxygen. The transition from vector to person took one heartbeat. Leaders either prepared their men for the whiplash or let them break their own necks on it. The moral hazard was mutual. U-boat memoirs would later confess the same wrench in reverse, torpedo a ship at midnight, surface to count lifeboats as proof of kill, and hear kids crying in languages you could almost understand. Men who were very good at war got very bad at sleeping. War at sea keeps two laws, the law of nations and the law of water. The first assigns flags and rules of engagement. The second predates language. It says, if a hand reaches from the ocean and you can pull, you pull. You might shackle that hand after. You might interrogate it, feed it, send it away to a camp. But you do not let it sink when you can bear its weight for a minute. Dwyer had learned that as a boy in a dory when his father fished wrecked lobster pots out of December water. You save what you can save, the old man said. Not because it belongs to you, because it belongs to the surface. He had written that memory into tactics. Guns hot, then guns cold, then blankets. Seamanship was ethics rehearsed until it looked like muscle memory. The moral turn was not sentimental. It was expensive. Every minute spent with nets and lines was a minute not hunting the next wolf. Every man leaning over the rail was a man whose center of gravity made the ship a little more tender in a gust. Mercy is risk, at sea more than anywhere. That is what gives it weight. On the other side, Heiden had his own law. He had told his crew after their first successful attack when nervous laughter made the boat smell like a butcher shop. We are not butchers, we are mechanics. We break machines that bring bombs and bullets. We do not rejoice at men drowning. If we can help a lifeboat live without dying ourselves, we will. If we cannot, we turn away with our eyes open. Some men believed him. Some didn't. All remembered he had said it. Tonight, both laws would be tested, of nations and of water. The U-boat had tried to kill the line. The cutter had tried to kill the U-boat. The Atlantic had taken its tax and given back wreckage and cries. Somewhere between the next wave and the one after, character would be a rope or a rifle. What mercy does to hatred is not simple. It doesn't erase it. It dilutes it, like fresh water poured into a barrel of brine until lips can drink. A rescued enemy does not become a friend. He becomes proof that you are still the kind of sailor you meant to be before the first torpedo ever found a home. Nora Hale kept a phrase for herself that she never wrote in the log. Soup is surrender. Not of a ship, not of a war, but of a moment. You surrender the pleasure of righteous anger to the discipline of care. She had learned this truth in a gale, holding a mug to the mouth of a man who had tried to drown a freighter full of flour. His hand stopped shaking. So did hers. On the bridge, Dwyer's eyes kept flicking between compass and sea, between abstraction and body. If the conning tower broke clean and a machine gun chattered from its trunk, he would finish the fight. If it broke dirty and men came up coughing oil, he would ring the bell for rescue. He knew it before it happened. That is what leadership is, deciding who you are 1 minute early. The storm would make both choices harder. Hale has no politics. Swell saves sinners and drowns saints without ceremony. Nets foul, lines snap, good intentions slip on cold iron. That is why the moral law at sea must be rehearsed like gunnery. You cannot invent mercy in a gale. You must have the lines coiled for it. The bearing steadied. The hedge pattern flew. The sea prepared its answer. And in that narrow silence between attack and aftermath, both crews were already becoming the men they would have to be when the light found faces. 0216 The ship's bones hummed. Bearing 285 steady, the sonar man said, a pencil ticking the chart with tiny, superstitious taps. Right 5, Dwyer answered. Make turns for 12. The helmsman nudged the wheel. The cutter shouldered into a wall of green and came out shining. Below, U3X's control room felt smaller by the second. Air was a wool blanket. Sweat had nowhere to go but each other's shirts. Heiden leaned over the depth gauge. Setschig, 60 meters. The boat creaked like a house bending in winter wind. Kalle called from the motor room. Battery 55%, 55%. Heiden did the arithmetic. Time was not a rope, it was a blade. 0217. Pattern 2 stand by, Dwyer said, voice level. Pike's gunners set fuses by touch, lips moving around numbers they didn't need to say. The Hedgehog projector crouched at the bow like a metal hedgehog remembering its purpose. Hold, the sonar operator breathed. A ping came back bent. Crossing starboard to port, range moderate, closing. Steady course, Dwyer said. Shoot on my mark. His hand rested on the railing. He could feel the ship's pulse through his glove. In U3X, Heiden lifted the periscope and saw night as a smear of green-black, then a white blink, searchlight grazing wave tops somewhere behind and left. His stomach tightened. Down scope. He pressed his palm to the cold brass until his blood cooled to its temperature. Rudder Zane backboard, he ordered, trying to slide sideways under the blind spot of a ship he could not see. 0218 mark fire, Dwyer said. The bow spat a bouquet of 24 armed teeth, their tails tracing brief sparks before the sea ate them. The ship rose to meet the next swell and the pattern leapt forward in a curve, falling like a thrown net. Silence. No depth charge roll, no theatrical thunder, only wind and water and men holding breath. The sonar set turned into a confessional. The operator exhaled in small, measured sips as if a loud breath could scare a hit back into a miss. Down below, the sonar return changed, something soft, something wrong. The operator's pencil stopped tapping. Contact altered echo. 0218 and 30 seconds the sea made a sound like a giant swallowing, a deep whump that came up through the cutter's keel and into the arches of every man's feet. The ship shivered once, pleased. U3X lurched. The hull rang like a struck bell. The bow pitched down hard, men grabbed whatever wasn't moving and then everything was moving. Scott, someone screamed. A flood of cold hit ankles. Kal's curse came back in a cough of diesel air. Vorderer Ausgleich Leck, forward trim tank leaking. Heiden tasted blood, he didn't remember hitting his mouth. Back emergency, Heiden snapped. Blow negative. Kal's hand found the valve and threw it. Compressed air bellowed into the tank and the boat kicked like a terrified horse. Depth spun, 60, 55, 50. Angle, Otto cried, one hand on Morse that had no one to talk to and one hand on the bulkhead that argued with gravity. 0219. On Wakefield, Pike's eyes were already forward. Oil slick, he said softly. A black tongue lapped through white water, expanding like a bruise. Star shell, negative, Dwyer said. Hold the dark, if she broaches we'll see enough. The sonar operator listened to returning pings stagger. Up angle, he said, surprised by his own voice. Come left 3, Dwyer ordered. Don't overrun her. He felt the urge to shout tamp down inside his chest like a cork. Calm is a tool, U3X bucked. The conning tower ladder became a cliff. Heiden scrambled, boots slipping on wet steel. Bridge, he snapped. Prepare to surface, emergency. Kalle banged a valve with his palm and felt it answer. Compt, she comes. The motor room was roar and prayer. 0219 and 40 seconds. Water exploded outward. A torn fin showed first, then black steel lunging upward as if purged by the sea itself. The conning tower broke surface crookedly, a ragged wound where the Wintergarten rails had been. Air burst from vents like the boat was coughing out its lungs. Men tumbled from the hatch in a spill of bodies that were not yet men, just shapes. One caught the rim and hung. One fell back and did not return. "Target broached," the starboard gun called, sight already swinging. The white cone of a searchlight snapped on, slicing rain. The tower and the wrecked bridge leapt into inhuman daylight. "Guns hold," Dwyer said. The order cost him a stripe of his breath. "Hold, watch for fire." If a gun chattered from that broken trunk, he would finish it. He felt the choice poised like a blade on a string. The conning tower coughed no bullets. It coughed men. A body in gray fell, hit the water, vanished, rose again in a blizzard of oil. Another flung himself outward and barely cleared the hatch. A third crawled along the rim like a child learning rails. Heiden came last, eyes full of light and salt, mouth open and speech stripped away by cold. "Rescue detail port side," Dwyer snapped, voice suddenly hard. "Pike lines and nets now, hail sickbay to stations." He flicked the searchlight wider, not to blind but to find. 0220. Pike's men moved as if storm and gravity had been rehearsed. "Jacob's ladder, let it run," he barked. The rope steps unraveled, wet immediately, heavy as sin. Heaving lines overshoot, windle deliver. Lime-spotted coils snaked into Gale and then swung back like dogs taught a trick. The U-boat's bow lifted, fell, lifted. The hatch vomited another figure, then belched a sheet of flame from somewhere below as oil found a spark. The tower's shadow jumped on the waves like a demon with too many legs. Heiden kicked free, mouth full of ocean. He felt for the boat as a man feels for his mother in a crowd and touched nothing that would save him. "Starboard screw, mind your wash," Pike called aft. The helmsman eased enough to save a life without killing steerage. The cutter came alongside the oil with the arrogance of a church entering a bar. A heaving line landed beyond a flailing arm. The wind blew it back into numb hands out of habit, not kindness. "Haul," Pike shouted. Two sailors leaned, then three, then four, pulling an enemy as if pulling their own brother up from a pier after too much whiskey. Arms over the rail, a body belly, flopped to steel. A hand scrabbled for a boot heel and found a deck. 0221. "Guns watch safed," Dwyer said, eyes never leaving the wrecked trunk for the flicker of betrayal that would end this experiment in virtue. It did not come. The tower slid lower, then went horizontal as water filled what air had lived there. A last man slid from the hatch on his back and laid on the water with his eyes open as if looking at a different sky. "Boat hook," Pike barked. The hook reached delicately through oil and lifted the man's collar like he was a baby. 2 hands, 3. The man came aboard and turned into a boy when he coughed, suddenly young, suddenly not a wolf. "Medic," Pike yelled. "On you," Nora Hale answered, already there. She cut kapok, cut straps, cut buttons. "Don't fight me," she told a face that didn't understand English and didn't need to. "Sip." She pressed a marked mug to a mouth trembling harder than the ship. 0222. The sea decided it had given enough men back for now. The U-boat shivered, the torn fin tilted, and the boat sank in an orderly hurry, as if embarrassed by the fuss. The white cone followed her down until only oil and a few planks and one cap remained. "Lights hold," Dwyer said quietly. "Rescue continues." He slid the searchlight's edge across the field, turning night into a catalog of what could still be saved. On the sound-powered phone, the sonar man's voice came soft, almost reverent. "Contact lost." Dwyer didn't answer him. He didn't have to. The answer was happening at the rail, hands hauling, hands cutting, hands giving heat back to men who had tried to steal theirs an hour before. The gale pushed another squall across the deck. Hail rattled on helmets and the ship shrugged. The convoy's tail lights rose and fell, each glow a small argument for civilization. The cutter balanced on the thin edge between two laws of nations and of water, and chose the older one first. 02 23. Oil slicked the deck like spilled ink. Pike's men moved with spread feet and bent knees, a dance learned in storms and refined in war. Lines arced, missed, learned the wind, and came back true. Jacob's ladder's breath down, up, down, offering a way to men whose hands no longer remembered ladders. "Take him," Pike barked, voice ragged and sure. A sailor with freckles and busted knuckles leaned dangerously far over the rail, caught a sleeve, and made a human hinge of his shoulder. Two more piled weight to drag the man inboard. Boots scraped. A body landed with a thud that sounded like a decision. Nora Hale knelt into the mess and made order from it. "Cut, don't pull," she said, scissors speaking where words could not. Kapok parted. Buttons popped. She pressed a mug to blue lips already forming a refusal. "Small sips, sailor, sip." The German coughed coffee and Atlantic back into the mug and onto her sleeve. She smiled anyway, tight, mechanical, real. A second heaving line snared another figure. The man, Otto Weiss, could feel nothing below the elbows. His fingers were rumor. He locked the line in the hinge of his arms and let strangers decide if he would be a person in 5 minutes. The rail rose. The ship slapped him like a correction. Hands found his armpits, and then there was steel below him and sky above him, and he was suddenly a child, retching brine and crying with the relief of mammals who have found air. "Get his jacket, cut those laces," Hale ordered. "Blanket, chest first, not limbs. Watch for afterdrop, talk to him, keep him awake." "What do I say?" a young corpsman asked. "Say his name if he knows it. Say yours if he doesn't." "Otto," the boy muttered. "Ich bin Otto." "Hi, Otto," the corpsman replied, as if they were on a street corner and not a moving island between death and paperwork. "I'm Ben. You're all right." 0224. Heiden came over the rail last of the living. Pike's boathook had reached him once and failed, skittering off slick cloth. The second reach found his belt. Heiden's hand rose, slow, reluctant, then obeyed instinct older than uniforms and closed around a stranger's wrist. The grip was weak and absolute. He cleared the scuppers with the grace of a sack and landed face down, coughing oil, eyes shut tight like prayer. "Commander," Pike asked Hale, a habit of language that had nothing to do with flags. She rolled Heiden gently. "He's no commander tonight," she said. "He's a patient." Heiden's eyes opened to a sky bladed by searchlight and sleet. He blinked at faces he had wired into enemy shapes since 1939 and found they were only faces. He tried to form the English for thank you and found only the German for still here. "Knock," he managed. Still. Dwyer watched from the bridge with a discipline that hurt. The urge to help with his own hands wrestled with the need to keep the ship from killing the men it was trying to save. "Port 10, he told the helmsman. "Keep our lee good." The searchlight kissed the water's wrinkles, widened to find a last pair of hands, then narrowed to spare the eyes of men who no longer needed to see the boat that had tried to drown them. "Guns safe and manned," Pike called up. "Rescue continuing." "Aye," Dwyer answered. The word felt like a prayer. 0226. In sickbay, steam fogged red lamps. Hale stripped oil with rags and patience. "Soap last," she muttered. "Heat first." She slid thermometers under tongues and on skin, counted silently, nodded, moved on. She wrote names on tape when she had them, numbers when she didn't. U3X unknown 1, U3X Otto, U3X Heiden. Her script stayed clean even when her hands shook. Cal Dorn sat on the lower bunk with his hands under blankets and his eyes on them like disobedient pets. He had not felt his fingers since the explosion. Now they prickled with pins of fire that promised to become pain. "Nicht reiben," Hale told him, wagging a finger. "No rub." Cal nodded. "Mechaniker," he said, thumping his chest lightly. "Hend nerdig, hands needed." "We'll keep them," Hale said. "They're stubborn like you." Otto sipped and shook and sipped again. He stared at the crucifix rattling on the bulkhead and then at the mug and then at the woman who insisted on life with so little ceremony. "War'em?" he asked, voice small. "Why?" Hale paused, considering the simplest answer that would travel across languages. "Seaman," she said. "Sailor." She tapped his chest. Then hers. "Seaman. Otto nodded, a child accepting a law of water older than his uniform. 0228. On deck, Pike's team had shifted to the terrible housekeeping that follows rescue. One body had come up too late. The men moved around it with the clumsy respect of people who want to be braver than their stomachs and sometimes are. Pike covered the face with a tarp and tied the corners quick. "XO," he called up to Dwyer. "One deceased." "Logged," Dwyer replied, throat tight. "We'll see him right after." The sea pressed the decision with Hale. They were still living to pull. A final figure drifted in the edge of the light, a shape half rope, half man. The line overshot, the wind brought it back. Fingers that were almost smiles found it and clung. The deck team hauled like fishermen who believed in saints. "Easy," Pike said, because easy sometimes obeys. 0231. The rescue curve flattened. No more hands rose. The water offered only oil and a floating cap. Dwyer narrowed the light until it became a courtesy instead of a search. "Secure rescue stations," he said softly. "Keep nets ready. We are not done with this ocean." Pike walked the rail like an old dog checking fence posts. He found a torn glove and a length of line that had tied a life to this ship for 1 minute. He pocketed the glove. Ritual is part of maintenance. Heiden stood in sickbay wrapped in 2 blankets, shivering with the dignity of a man who refuses to make noise. He looked at Hale's hands, at the labels, at the mugs lined like small promises. "Oberleutnant Heiden," he managed finally, as if reporting aboard. "Nora," she replied. "Welcome to the wrong ship." He smiled a ghost. "Richtig, right." Otto reached for his harmonica out of habit and found nothing at his belt. Panic rose, absurd and ferocious. "Verloren," he whispered, "lost." Hale mistook the word and put a hand on his shoulder. "Not you," she said, "not tonight." The panic retreated, confused but obedient. 0234. Pike herded the rescued below one by one. "Watch your feet," he said, a useless kindness and thus exactly the right one. He paused beside the covered shape under the tarp and took off his cap for the space of a breath. Then he put it back on and went to coil a line that had saved more men than medals had. Dwyer took a final sweep with the light and shut it down. Darkness returned not as an enemy but as a blanket over work well done. The convoy's tail lamps winked like distant hearths. The cutter's deck steamed like a horse after a run. "XO, you have the deck," the captain said, voice worn thinner than his coat. "Set course to rejoin. Make signal to convoy, rescue effected. Continuing escort." "Aye, sir." Dwyer allowed himself to lean once into the wind as if bowing to an altar and then return to his meters and his men. 0238. In sickbay, Hale counted pulses and sips. Cal flexed fingers slowly and grinned like a mechanic who had tricked a seized engine into turning. Heiden stared at the deck and then at Hale and then at the steel wall, trying to anchor in a reality where an enemy's blanket had his smell now. Otto slept with the mug still warm in his hands, the crucifix rattling above him in time with the sea's breath. On the mess deck, an American sailor ladled soup for the deck team and for the prisoners in equal scoops because that is how the ladle had been trained. He set a bowl in front of Heiden and hesitated, then added half again without looking up. Sloppiness, perhaps, or culture. Pike stood in the hatch and watched men who had nearly killed each other an hour ago learn how to share heat. "Soup s on," he said to no one and everyone. It sounded like peace pretending not to be. Hale wrote one last line in the log before the ink could smear with spray. Rescue complete. Multiple hypothermia. Prognosis guarded but hopeful. She closed the book and pressed her palm to it for the length of a heartbeat. Then she opened it again to leave space for names that had not yet remembered themselves. Outside, the sea kept its counsel. Inside, blankets and soup conducted a ceremony older than victory. By 0300, the cutter had rejoined the screen. Men leaned where they were allowed to lean. The storm knocked once at the hull and moved on to other arguments. What had begun as a hunt had ended in a reckoning, and the reckoning had chosen to pull upward. First light didn't look like light so much as a paler kind of gray. The gale had shaved itself down to a steady shove. The convoy's column reasserted its geometry, freighters like tired cattle finding a trail. Wakefield rode her station off the tail, a little scuffed, a little proud. Paper came out as if summoned by dawn itself. Pike's deck log smelled like salt and pencil shavings. He wrote in block letters because wind disrespects cursive. 02-16 contact held. 02-18 Hedgehog pattern 2 fired. 02-19-21 broach U-boat foundering. 02-22-34 rescue conducted. He paused, looked up at the sea as if it could correct him, then added, 1 deceased recovered. Respect rendered. In the radio shack, the talk was careful. Convoy command got the essentials in squashed words. Rescue effected. POWs aboard. Continue screen. Otto, dozing on a stretcher near the bulkhead, recognized the rhythm even through sleep and trembled, smiling without knowing why. Morse is a lullaby to men who have survived it. In sickbay, steam and order replaced the night's panic. Hale's handwriting marched cleanly across the log. U3X unknown 1 hypothermia shallow, warmed by chest and compress. U3X Dorn KH hands numbed reperfusion pain, no frostbite, function likely. U3X Weiss O mild pulmonary aspiration, coherent, requires rest, small sips only. U3X Heiden K shock, oriented ×2 place, person, vitals stabilizing. She noted the tarp-wrapped body with a line that stayed the same for every flag, deceased recovered, identity pending. She closed the log on that line for a moment, palm flat, the way a priest might cover a chalice. Then she opened it and kept working. Pike supervised a quiet, inelegant ceremony aft. The body went over with dignity and weight. A canvas shroud sewn fast around ankles and a piece of iron. Dwyer read the short words that fit all religions, C words, simple and square. The crew shifted weight like an amen. The splash was modest. Some men crossed themselves. Some didn't. Each saw his own name stitched into canvas in a future they hoped wouldn't arrive. By noon, the paperwork multiplied like gulls. The captain's report wore its Navy grammar. Engaged and destroyed enemy submarine by a head-thrown contact weapon. Commenced rescue in accordance with convoy safety. Enemy survivors treated per Navy regulations, and Geneva. It said nothing of the coffee ring that bloomed on the margin when a wave ran up the hull and splashed the desk. Nora Hale initialed the medical addendum with a hand that now shook only when it had time. Dwyer sat on the bridge wing and ate a sandwich that salt and sun had already seasoned. He stared at the convoy, gray blocks hauling a war forward 1 wake at a time, and felt the strange fatigue that follows right action. It isn't sleepiness. It's a subtraction of tension that leaves muscles wondering what to do with the new slack. Pike appeared with 2 tin mugs and set one down by his boot. "Soup," he said. "Again?" Dwyer asked, half-smile. "Still the right prescription," Pike answered, and the wind stole the steam. Heiden, now tagged and warm in a blanket that had a U.S. stencil peeking through the wool, sat on the mess bench opposite a sailor from Maine who had just learned his face could look like calm even when his heart was still running. They shared silence. After a while, Heiden mustered 3 English words. "Good ship. Good." The sailor nodded once, as if complimented personally, then pushed half his bread across. Heiden accepted with the grace of a man who had remembered the right size for need. Cal flexed his fingers and counted off movements like a mechanic checking tolerances. Thumb to forefinger to middle, murmuring, gut, gut, as if he were tuning a carburetor. Otto slept, woke, took a breath that didn't rattle, and saw the crucifix move rhythmically. It made sense. Boats and crosses both love beams. On the fantail, Pike found the torn glove again in his pocket and considered throwing it overboard as an offering to any saint that monitored repairable mistakes. He kept it. Better to patch it and wear it until it died properly. By late afternoon, the convoy raised a smutty horizon of smoke where destination might one day be. Wakefield's engines settled into a tone old-timers called honest steam. The gale was now only weather. Men returned to jobs that kept the ship an organism: grease, swab, lash, stow. Duty recaptured the day like a harbor recaptures a boat. In the wardroom, the captain signed the last page, then set his pencil down as if ending a prayer. He stood, went to sickbay, looked at the 4 living proofs of a doctrine older than this war, and said only, "Welcome aboard." The words felt odd in his mouth and exactly right. He left without waiting for thanks he did not want. At dusk, signal lamps winked among escorts, an alphabet that pretends to be fireflies. Dwyer watched them and felt the ship steady under him, an animal that had done the hard pull and decided to keep living. On the bulkhead outside sickbay, Hale taped a card where every passerby would see it, the letters printed large and square. No GIFTS, no talk, only quiet. Mercy has housekeeping. She enforced it with the same seriousness she brought to bandages. The sea, finally, allowed a sunset that looked like bruised fruit. Men who had seen death as a profession watched color return to the world as if it were a favor. Paper was filed. Ink dried. Steam curled from mugs. The cutter kept her place. The night would come again, as it always does. But this one would arrive over a deck that smelled, briefly, stubbornly, of coffee more than cordite. Weeks blurred into wakes. The convoy made harbor short by 2 ships and long by 4 lives that should have been lost. The cutter took on fuel and flour and rumors, then went back to sea because that was the contract. The rescued men went ashore in gray wool that didn't fit, tagged, logged, escorted to a camp where fences were made of wire and decency. In the transit shed, Heiden signed a paper he did not read. A U.S. petty officer with a pencil behind one ear said "Sir" without sarcasm and pointed him toward a column of names that did not yet know how to be prisoners instead of crew. Heiden obeyed, then paused, then turned back. "Name of ship?" he asked, careful with English. The petty officer looked up, surprised to be included in a story. "Wakefield," he said. Heiden nodded once, folded the name into the same place. He kept the names of ports and teachers and streets. Otto found a Red Cross form and wrote 2 sentences to his mother in Hamburg. "Ich lebe, mir ist warm. I live. I am warm." The guard who stamped it had never learned German and recognized only the shape of relief. He stamped faster. Kalle flexed his hands every morning like a ritual, the way men test a rope before trusting a weight to it. He signed up for the camp repair shop and made a generator sing with less wire than it wanted. When the American supervisor offered cigarettes as payment, Kalle shook his head and pointed to his fingers. "Dies," he said. "These." The supervisor nodded. He understood a man who worked for the joy of anything that still ran. Nora Hale received a thin, official letter 3 months later on paper that looked like it had never known salt. It was from a nurse in the POW infirmary. "The men you brought in are well. The one called Dorn has full use of his hands. The one called Weiss plays a harmonica after supper and makes our guards homesick in a good way. The officer, Heiden, reads English now. He keeps a list. He writes Wakefield neat." Nora folded the page and put it behind the crucifix in sickbay without deciding why. There were echoes aboard the cutter as well. Pike's deck gang retold the night as if it were a kit to be assembled. Heaving line overshoot, wind did the work. Pike says easy, boat hook like a spoon. They improved their stories each telling, sharpening the parts where competence had been luck and dulling the parts where luck had been mistaken for competence. Rituals like that keep ships honest. Dwyer wrote something he had never written before, a letter to the family of the deceased they'd sent down under canvas. He didn't know the man's name, so he addressed it to a city keel care of Chance. He enclosed the torn glove Pike had kept cleaned and neatly patched. He wrote, "We could not keep him. The sea would not allow it. We did what we could with the rest." He didn't expect it to reach anyone, and he was right. Still, the writing completed an arithmetic that had no other solution. The captain's report made its way upward and outward. A paragraph found its way into a bulletin for escort commanders. In heavy weather, if contact is destroyed and broach yields survivors, rescue may be safely undertaken provided convoy integrity maintained. Prepare stations in advance. Rehearse mercy. The last two words were Pike's, smuggled into doctrine through Dwyer's pen. Policy travels faster when it sounds like common sense. Months later, in a camp library where books smelled like dust from 2 wars ago, Heiden found a battered English reader. He practiced aloud under his breath. Good morning. Good night. Thank you. He added one more that the book did not offer, Wakefield. A guard asked what that word meant. Heiden said, a kind ship. The guard snorted, embarrassed by the feeling the word gave him, and changed the subject. Otto's harmonica came by parcel post, a miracle accomplished by bureaucracy and a quartermaster who presumed music was contraband only when loud. He kept the instrument wrapped in a towel when he wasn't breathing into it. When he did, the notes turned the barracks into something like an evening. American guards leaned by the door and pretended not to listen. A German mechanic with whole hands clapped the offbeats exactly wrong. Men smiled anyway. Music forgives timing. Cal wrote a postcard in scratchy script to an address in Bremen where an engine he had loved now lay in half a warehouse. The card said only, Ich repariere noch. I am still repairing. He signed it with a grease thumbprint that looked like a seal more official than any he'd ever earned. On Wakefield, Nora Hale took the card from the POW nurse down from behind the crucifix once and reread it in the dim of another gale. She tapped the edge against her teeth, smiling a private smile not of victory, but of confirmation. Then she slid it back and tightened the screw a quarter turn. Objects at sea take comfort from being held fast. Dwyer got orders for a stateside training billet in the fall. Before he left, he stood at the bow alone and said out loud, "We did right, because sometimes a man needs to hear a sentence become air." Pike watched from the wing, said nothing, and later stole one of Dwyer's pencils as a relic. Years after the war, a letter with careful English arrived at the Coast Guard archive. It was from a watchmaker in Lübeck, Karl Heiden. He enclosed a photograph of a workbench and a pocket watch whose back he had engraved with one word, Wakefield. The curator filed it with a one-line note, "Enemy survivor thanks Cutter for blankets and soup." It sat in a folder no one opened often. That was all right. The sea had already kept the memory. Some nights when the wind runs long and low, men who were there still hear the sound that divides a hunt from a rescue, the hush after a pattern, the breath before a beam finds faces, the scrape of boots on wet deck, the small, grateful clink of an enamel mug on steel. The ocean is a poor archivist and a perfect witness. It forgets names and remembers noises. And among those noises is a law spoken without words. You pull upward. History writes of the Atlantic as a hunting ground, steel predators and steel prey, measured in tonnage lost, convoys arrived and submarines destroyed. But once in a while, the numbers miscount on purpose. They miss the night a ship stopped killing long enough to remember that oceans, too, have room for grace. Wakefield's story never made front pages. It didn't need to. It survived in the quiet language of conduct reports and in the way men spoke afterward, less certain, more human. For Dwyer, the hunt had been the trade, mercy became the education. For Pike, who once believed the sea took back everything, it became proof that sometimes the sea could give. In a war of absolutes, they had found something conditional but durable, decency. A new kind of strength, one that did not measure itself by kills but by what it refused to destroy. The blankets, the soup, the steady hands, they were not acts of softness. They were acts of control, the rarest skill in war. The German sailors carried that lesson home in pockets meant for shrapnel. Some rebuilt engines. Some taught apprentices. One became a watchmaker who engraved a single ship's name into time. Across the world, the cutter's logs turned brittle in Navy archives, but the salt that had once dried on their pages stayed luminous when caught by the right angle of light. If you stand on a pier in Halifax or Hamburg or Boston on a calm night, you can still feel it, the faint vibration of a convoy engine, the heartbeat of a boat that chose not to let men drown simply because they had worn the wrong flag. It is a small story compared to empires and treaties, but sometimes it is the small stories that repair the noise of larger ones. When the night closed in on that April sea, both sides believed they were enemies. By dawn, they had remembered they were sailors first. And sailors, when the water turns black and cold, do not ask who a man was before he fell in. They ask how to pull him out. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.